Welcome to our first video looking at questions of privacy and older adults. Protection of privacy has become one of the primary concerns for people in the 21st century. When we're talking about it within the context of older adults and in the context of this lecture series, I am talking about privacy predominantly related to the legal issues of privacy in terms of rights and responsibilities. So I'm not talking about people's perceptions of privacy, i.e., if you're going to use the restroom and somebody comes in on you, you may feel that that's an invasion of privacy. I'm not talking about that type. I'm talking about who gets to know what information, in what way, and who doesn't. We have 3 different kinds of privacy legislation in Canada. And if you find it confusing, you're not alone. Most people in Canada find the privacy legislation a bit of a morass. In fact, you'd be forgiven if you were one of the people who didn't want to release any information to anybody because you felt concerned that the privacy issues may come back on you. Indeed, I think that there is a great resistance to releasing information for fear of violating some kind of privacy provision. Having said that, there's many cases in which you can release information, and the health field is one of those that actually you can, and in some cases you cannot. So I'm glad you're taking this course. There are 3 kinds of statutes. The first is a narrow one. It's called the Privacy Act, the Federal Privacy Act. And it sounds all-encompassing, but it's actually quite narrow. It only covers federal employees, so public servants in public agencies of the federal government. And it covers the obligations on essentially 200 or so federal agencies respecting the rights of the individuals. And this is the act that limits the collection and use and disclosure of personal information in the course of providing public services. So if you work for a federal agency as a public servant, you are going to likely be subject to the restrictions of the Privacy Act. It says what you can collect information for. Now, we may have seen in recent news reports concerns about both the Canadian and the American government collecting all kinds of information for all kinds of reasons. And that's a question about whether it's violated the Privacy Act. Under the Privacy Act, the federal government, in its public sector employees, only can gather certain information for certain things. And under this act, individuals of which the information is about, have the right to get that information. So you can actually get a privacy inquiry and you can find out what the information says about you. So that's the first tier. The second tier is more of a blanket across the country. And we have a piece of legislation called PIPEDA. You've probably heard about it before. And PIPEDA is actually short for the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. And most times when people are talking about privacy legislation, they're talking about PIPEDA. And so the federal government enacted this legislation to blanket the entire country. And it covers all organizations which are commercial. So it means if you're doing a commercial activity, you are subject to PIPEDA. Now, the reason why they did a blanket kind of legislation is they said, well, provinces can do their own, and if it's substantially similar to PIPEDA, that's fine, then you can use the provincial version. And only a couple provinces have done so. Every other province is relying on PIPEDA. So we'll talk about which provinces have their own provincial legislation, and thus they don't need PIPEDA, and which ones don't. Again, PIPEDA is blanket legislation across the country, applying to all organizations engaged in commercial activities. Now, what about nonprofit organizations? Well, they come into a funny area. Generally, most nonprofit organizations or charities, etc., aren't actually engaged in commercial activities. Now, some may be enterprising nonprofits and so forth. But the nonprofit status does not automatically exempt an organization from the application of the federal legislation, and if you're one of the few provinces that has provincial legislation, your nonprofit agency may be caught in there. So people who work for nonprofit organizations have to be very careful about what requirements they have. Now, if you're working for a commercial enterprise, a business, etc., it's really easy. You are subject to PIPEDA unless you're one of the provinces that has the provincial legislation, and then you're subject to that. If you're a nonprofit, you really have to check what your obligations and rules are. So PIPEDA, again, this federal blanket legislation, sets out ground rules, if you want to call it that, over the management of the information in the private sector. Now remember, public sector is the Privacy Act of Canada. PIPEDA is for the private sector. So how organizations, companies, etc. collect and use data for commercial activities. Now, the federal government can provide exemptions, again, for those who've adopted the provincial legislation. The underlying requirement in all privacy legislation is to balance an individual's right to privacy of their own personal information with the needs of an organization to collect it. And they have to collect it for a legitimate business purpose. They can't just collect it because they're interested in it. Now, you could offer it to them, that's fine, but they can't go mining it out unless there's a legitimate reason. So, in summary, organizations that are covered by the blanket of PIPEDA have to get an individual's consent when they collect, use, or get the personal information. Now, you'll see those in the health consent forms. Usually you have to tick off a box and sign that you say you consent to the collection of this data and the sharing of it as well. So you can't just kind of collect it without people knowing. Again, that's kind of the problem with the recent news reports with the federal government of Canada and the United States collecting data on the internet and so forth, is that it was not collected with people's consent. So you have to get consent to use or disclose the information. People have to understand what it means. In business practices, a lot of those loyalty cards require that you give consent and then they track your status. In the health field, although some of it is private and commercial, in terms of private health care, you do have to make sure that people understand and appreciate that you're collecting the data and for what purposes you'll be using the data for. If an organization is going to use it for another purpose, again, consent has to be obtained. So if you're going to use it for your own purpose, you have to get consent. If you're going to use it for a secondary purpose, or you're going to give it to somebody else, or you're going to sell it to somebody else, or you're going to use it for another purpose, like research, for instance, you also have to get separate consent. Individuals also have to be assured that the information is going to be kept safe and that there are specific safeguards. Could be passwords, password protection, could be locked cabinets, whatever it is, there are actual requirements that the information be held in a safe case. And that concludes our overview. In summary, the more than 200 federal public agencies are subject to the Privacy Act. All organizations in Canada are covered by the blanket of PIPEDA unless you're one of the provinces that has done their own, in which case the blanket's got a hole and you take your requirements from your provincial legislation instead. And last, commercial enterprises must get consent for any gathering of information and must get consent again for any secondary purpose that they use it for. Nonprofits generally are exempt from PIPEDA because they are not engaged in commercial enterprise, except that it's not automatic. If you're a part of a nonprofit agency, you really have to go make sure that you're not running afoul of your legislation. And some nonprofits are specifically governed by the few provincial legislations associated with it if you're one of those provinces. And we'll go through which provinces those are in the next video. Thank you.